Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Prague. I'm sure you've been here already a few days. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to CEPA, or CEPA, I'm not sure how they pronounce themselves, for inviting me to speak to you today, which is an enormous privilege. And apologies that you're not in my office. I'm afraid that even though Baker Tilly is the 8th largest accounting and auditing network in the world, as far as Prague is concerned, we have no longer, we used to have a seminar room that will accommodate 30 people, 30 plus people. Because of the downturn and the need for everybody to save money, we had to do away with that luxury, so we turned it into a normal room for employees and moved out of one of the offices and rationalised it a little bit. So now we're in a situation where we don't have a meeting room to accommodate all of you at our place, otherwise I would love to have you at our offices. It reminds me a little bit of when I was starting out in Poland about 21 years ago, when I understood that a Chinese gentleman was going to come and see me, and that he was going to bring an interpreter. He spoke something which would have somebody with him. And we had at that time an 8-person meeting room, rather like I have in Prague now. Well, people started to turn up about half an hour beforehand, and most of them didn't speak any English, and there was me just trying with faltering Mandarin to try and say, Chinzo, and sit down and ta, and what have you. And it's very, very difficult and embarrassing. And the guy that's actually supposed to be the person I was meeting didn't turn up until already there was 14 other people there in the meeting. So everybody else in the office, because it was just the start, we only had a small team, was sitting on their desks working in different rooms. And we were 14, we were sitting too deep, the 2 people deep around the table in this tiny meeting room, in the middle of a Polish summer with no air conditioning. So that was really quite amusing. And what was even more amusing after that was when the guy finally turned up and he asked me a question: can he get investment reliefs on a building? Because he said about being able to get investment reliefs on a building if he invests over €1 million. And I said, sure, you can do that, we can do that for you. And he said, well, that's fine because the building's already finished. I thought, okay, so tell me why I'm going to be able to get the government to give you an incentive to invest money when you've already put it here and can't get it back out again. And of course, that was rather difficult thing. I had to be very diplomatic about it, because as you know, in China they have they sell a lot of store by face. Yeah, this mianzi, as they call it, the face. You mustn't lose face in front of people. So it was very difficult, so I had to be very diplomatic about it, and sort of like bow bravely and say, well, unfortunately, it may be more difficult. It's something more difficult when you put your head to one side and go. It's a little bit more difficult in those circumstances. In order to not say no to somebody in front of 14 people cramped around a meeting room door. That's just an example of how you have to be a little bit culturally aware. But let me just at the moment start off by drawing you an image on here. Can everybody see this? Because it's frightfully deep. Maybe I'll tell you. By all means, make a note of this. My details here, djames@bakertilly.pl, there's my phone number, there's my name again. If ever you need an accountant, auditor, tax advisor, lawyer, payroll clerk, anything anywhere in the world, call me. I've got networks. Link to me on LinkedIn, link to me on Facebook, is good, okay? Right, what's this? Anybody know what that is yet?
A world.
A world? It might be well be a world for some small insects that live on it. You beat me to it. You say tomato. Yeah, I say tomato. And not only is there a difference between tomato and tomato, when it comes to whether people can get on with each other. I mean, in the song by George and Ira Gershwin, you have the 2 people, basically realising they're fighting over things which are not particularly important. And, in American English, you sometimes hear the phrase tomato, tomato. Yeah? So we're arguing over things which are pointless. But the point is really that even over little things like that, people can actually get between themselves awfully frustrated. When it comes to England, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just whether a person says tomato with a long sort of like A or tomato with like an R. Yeah? We all say tomato in England. But some people go tomato, and some people go tomato. Yeah? Can I have tomato? That's right, it always sounds like tomorrow, doesn't it? But when tomorrow comes, they'll be probably pronouncing some different way still. But and in England, whether you can actually get a job or not in a certain place or be a member of a certain golf club might well depend on whether you can say tomato or you say tomato. Yeah. So England is a very well, it's not a classy society; it's a class-based society, unfortunately. And the way you speak can actually determine whether you win jobs or lose jobs. And most English people in business, British people in business, have developed a kind of neutral voice. So that when those who can, not everybody's able to do it, but those who can, have developed a kind of neutral voice. Where they answer the phone in a kind of very neutral RP English, the one that I try to talk in most of the time, which is not too posh and not too non-posh. And then they're listening for what the voice at the other end will say, especially if they're the one trying to sell to the other person, rather than being the buyer. And the buyer can talk how the hell they like, but the seller wants to be culturally aware of what the buyer might want. And in England, that's all to do with class, or not all to do with class, but a larger amount to do with class. And in a more class 3, or aspiring to be a class 3 society, I don't think the United States is by any means a class 3 society, but it aspires to be a class 3 society. It wouldn't want to say, hey, we're a very class-based society, and we're proud of it. Quite the opposite. America aims to be a class 3 society, and prides itself on attempts to be a class 3 society. So in England, if you listen, you listen to what the guy on the other end of the phone sounds like, and you adjust your own accent up or down a notch, if you can, those who can, depending on what you hear. Now that's necessary in England. It's necessary in 1 or 2 other countries, but in the main, many countries you don't need to do that at all. But basically, the word tomato shows you, or even itself, the importance of language in culture. I don't want to talk an awful lot about that, but because I did this in a previous lecture, which later on, if you're interested, I can link you to. It was another culture lecture, which was perhaps a little bit more simple than the one I want to give to you today. I see more mature students here today. I'd like to actually, I also did some research on your university, and I know that I can stretch you guys more than I did the last lot. So that's why this isn't going to be a repetition of the one I did before. But if anybody's interested, then I can send you links to the one that I did before. Just a lot of the jokey stuff about how different words mean different things in different languages, and how the Swedish couldn't understand why the English were laughing when they put up a Hoover advert for their Hoover. Nothing sucks like Electrolux and things like that. There was a lot of that in the old lecture. It's all fun and what have you. But I don't want to get too much into that. A little bit more serious, I think. But what I do want to say on language is clearly an area where culture is going to come off. It's going to affect culture a lot. It's the language how it works, but it's also a two-way street between language and culture. I mean, for example, we have the word tomato or tomato in the English language, but anybody know where it comes from? Sorry? Latin's not true, although I like the idea of that. It comes from Latin America, I'll give you that much, because that's where they came from originally, although they were more like cherry tomatoes. I also one day somebody gave me, I saw on a menu that there was some salad with cherry tomatoes. Oh, that's interesting. It'd be interesting to try a tomato that tastes like a cherry, And when they brought me this salad with cherry tomatoes, anybody have cherry tomatoes? When they brought me the salad with the cherry tomatoes, I wanted to throw it back at them, because they tasted like tomatoes. They didn't taste like cherries at all. I said, waiter, where was this? You told me these were cherry tomatoes. They look like cherries. I said, are you sick? Well, I wasn't quite that rude, actually. But I probably wanted to say if I was probably a bit more diplomatic. I said, they don't look like cherries, my friend. Cherries look different to this. These look like tomatoes. And he said, well, no, tomatoes are much bigger than this. I said, you're talking about certain cultivars, first made in Ohio in the United States of America. About a century or two after tomatoes were first eaten by people, yeah? They only got that big in the United States of America. The initial, in fact, I'm not even sure it was the United States by then, but Ohio anyway. And the original tomato looks like what you've just told me would be a cherry. So I'm not happy, and I'm not giving you a tip. But it's a good way of saving money anyway. But, so basically, the word tomato actually comes from a Nahuatl language word, and as in Nahuatl, everything ends in TL, like axolotl. I don't know if you know an axolotl, it's kind of like new thing, some people keep it as a pet. Everything ends in tl in Nahuatl. So the original word for a tomato was actually tomato. Yeah? And we took that word from via Spanish. The Spanish took it from there, because the Spanish were the ones mucking about down there rather than the English who mucked about further north. So the Spanish took this and started to say, hey, this is good, we quite like this, doesn't taste much of cherries, but we do like it. And they started to bring it all around the world, and they introduced it to the Anglo world as well, if you like, the Anglosphere as it's sometimes called. And everybody started eating them. Some of them called them tomatoes, some of them called them tomatoes, but the Mexicans still called them tomato. Yeah? But the fact that we have this borrowing from Mexican via Spanish is an example of what Henry Hitchens, not Henry Higgins, he was from My Fair Lady, Henry Hitchens calls a borrowing is a witness to one culture rubbing up against another culture. So whenever you borrow words from another language, it's because your culture has abraded in some way against that other culture. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to borrow the word. Yeah? If you had the thing that's there, you wouldn't. If it was something that you weren't surprised by in some way and found new, and which caused you a small amount of shock, you would simply make up your own word for it. Yeah? Making up words is actually quite hard for human beings. Well, I'm talking about making words up completely randomly. If you look at your language, there's any language, even those of you in the room that know a lot of other languages, you can look at whichever language it is, and the words, or for example in English, you'll see a lot of them are spelled in a way different to the way they're pronounced. Yeah? I know that the Americans have gone a long way to put this problem right. You have words like light and tonight in American English, which is got ITE on the end, rather than IGHT, but then the question is really, why is it ITE, and not go the whole way and actually have it phonetically AIT, which is a bit more phonetic than ID, yeah? Because somebody from this part of the world would look at tonight spelled the so-called easy way, and say, well, that looks like tonite. Yeah? But nevertheless, the old spellings that we have, so that tonight looks like tonicht, yeah? Tell us about the fact that that word comes from an old Anglo-Saxon expression, and that the word for tonight, in older English, or at least the word for night, would have been nicht, yeah? And not night at all. So the history of language shows us, or linguistics shows us, philology shows us, that words almost always come from either an older version of your own language, or they're a borrowing from another word in another language, or there's something called a calque, C-A-L-Q-U-E, which basically is something like you take an expression in another language and you translate it into your own language using the instruments available in your language, but the idea of the phrase still is something taken from a different language. So it's not a direct borrowing of a word, it sounds like your language, but it came from a different language in terms of the expression. And almost every word that we have has some kind of etymology, some kind of origin that you can study. There are some that we're not too clear about. Quiz, for example, is one that people are not too clear about. But even company names. They have, it's very difficult to find somebody invent a name for a company that isn't either their own name, the name of the founder. De Vries University had an interesting history, you probably know the history of your own university. It started off as being somebody else, De Forest, wasn't it? Yeah, well, in the early days, De Vries University in Tel Aviv, I've been actually doing this. It was first of all called De Forest, because De Vries was the real founder, but he thought, well, naming after myself is a bit much, I don't want to be immodest here. So he's my chum, yeah, De Forest, I'll name it after him. Yeah? So after he died, De Forest said, I want it renamed after De Vries. So it was like a kind of mutual admiration society between those two guys. But fair enough, the guy had enough modesty to not name it after himself at the beginning. So first, you can look it up on Wikipedia if you don't believe me. Yeah. But it's an example of an institution named after the founder. Okay. Others, for example, these days, you've got lots and lots and lots of things going on the internet. There's about 2 billion web pages, probably one for every person who actually even goes on the internet in the world. And that's not the number of pages, probably rather fewer sites with individual names. But they've all got to think of names for themselves. And if you now go and try and get anything.com, you're going to have your work cut out. So in order to get something meaningful, people have to go for longer and longer and longer names.com. And of course it becomes very difficult because when you send anyone an email, it gets very boring because you have to type about 15 letters and it's not very cool really. So people start to bring in things like hyphens or not hyphens, they bring in numbers instead of letters, but then it gets very confusing. The fact is, we've probably got too few words for the number of individual things that people want to do creatively with language and names, proper names, now around the world. And the globalization of thinking, especially in the internet, is putting pressure on the words that there are. So in the end what's happening is you get more different endings. So you've got country code endings, and then you've got other things coming out like .biz, .mobi and what have you, just so that people can get enough internet space for the word that they can use to name their website. But if you take these really popular ones, even with those, you can almost always think, well, it tells me something. The name of this site tells me something. Like, for example, Facebook. Yeah? It tells me, it's like a book of faces. Yeah? I mean, some people do put other parts of their anatomy on other than their face, but they usually get taken down quite quickly. And for example, Google. That might sound to you as though it's a complete, thought of from thin air. But when you think about it, it's actually go ogle. Yeah? Go and have a look at something. A great term for a search engine. And even if people think, this is the funny thing, even when people think they've grabbed something completely original, then a linguist can say, well, actually, that's not entirely original, it's not entirely completely original. Completely original language would be something like, yeah? And you try writing that down. You just try writing that, yeah? So that, you know, so you have to come up with something based on the instruments, the phonemic representations that you've got already in a language, especially English language, and the meanings intrinsic in words. Now, I don't know if you know this company. I see some cameras around, so I know you've all heard of the company that's filed now, very unfortunate really, for Section 11 bankruptcy, Kodak, yeah? Now, where do you think that name came from?
A bear.
A bear. That's what I thought as well, but in fact it does suggest a bear. When I was young and I saw that for the first time, I thought, oh great, Kodak, that's a bear, yeah? And in fact, the problem is that it's a Kodiak bear, which I only discovered that afterwards. I was really disappointed, because I was really pressed. I thought, well, that means that Kodak doesn't mean a bear after all. I was really actually quite upset by it. But the Kodak actually, was it the name, do you think that was the name of the person that founded Kodak? Well, I'll put you out of your misery on that one, because it wasn't. Kodak was founded by Mr. Who? Anybody know? Eastman, well done. And Mr. Eastman thought of the name Kodak, and he was one of the few people, he was one of the few exceptions that prove the rule, that normally people don't think of a random word for a product. They usually think of something, you know, like, would be like a, you know, like click or something onomatopoeic maybe, something which, where the meaning of it is memorable, but is a clue to what's going on. Well, Kodak actually, it's a nice word, but it's actually one of the few totally random coinages. Mr. Eastman was obviously a visionary and willing to actually go the extra mile, but most people wouldn't do that because they feel stupid about it. Actually putting out a word that, you know, people would be going, what's that supposed to mean? You know, whereas, where does that word come from? And people do this unconsciously. People actually get very self-conscious about saying, well, I'm going to call my product, and they come up with something completely random. Yeah, just people are worried, this is going to sound a bit silly, and people aren't going to take it seriously. Well, I don't feel like comfortable with that. And that's how it is in language as well. So almost everything that you see around you, and everything you use and everything you do, has an etymology. Now, English has borrowings from 350 odd languages. So therefore, our language has more cultural openness than almost, well, than for certain any other language in the world. Americans and British people can take pride in the fact that they have something approaching the default world culture, in as much as there is one. Okay, so if you go to international gatherings and you behave, you speak in American English and you behave like an educated American, you're going to be the norm. If you go to somewhere like, you know, if you turn up in Geneva and go to a meeting with the World Health Organization and you behave like a normal educated American, you're going to be the norm. You'll find that there's more people trying to act like you than you have to try and adjust to act like them. And that gives us a certain sense of, well, that's fine, that means everything we do is okay. It isn't. And it's possible to give a lot of offence and to cause a lot of discomfort to yourself, especially when you're in a situation where in the future you might have got your business degree, you might be sent out to other places, parts around the world, and you might find that people react to you in a very disappointing way that you don't understand. Yeah? And that's why, even though we're at an advantage that we're actually much more, in fact, we're almost a vehicle, English language is almost a vehicle, whereby the rest of the world understands each other. So when the Chinese now go and invest in Africa, they're not trying to make the Africans learn Mandarin. They know it's going to be a bit much, you know, the lead time would be too big. They've got Africa, large numbers of Africans with an awareness of English. They simply go, they talk to them in English. So other parts of the world trying to understand each other's cultures often use English as the vehicle. That's why we're becoming almost like a default international culture. But for you to rely on that, if you in the future end up with a job where you're going to go around the world and go to different factories or different offices in different countries and try and make people do what you would like them to do as managers, and you want to rely on the fact that you've got the American culture, you might find that it causes you some pain. Okay? And that's why we're going to have a discussion today. We've got not a lot of time, in fact, just to go through a few things. But hopefully it'll get you thinking and set you off on a certain journey, what I'm going to say for the next hour and a half now still got left. Now, the word culture itself, where does that come from?
At some point left, there's only one of the answers.
Yes, and it's the answer right now. So that was a very timely response. It is indeed from Latin. Anybody have an idea what it means in Latin, what culture means, what cultura means in Latin? What it actually means? It means cultivation. Yeah? So cultura just meant cultivation. Yeah? Which means, of course, caring for something so that it grows. Is that culture became, we're talking about the cultivation, a person showing their own cultivation, their own upbringing, if you like, their own class. And some people, when you talk about culture to some people, they think you're talking about the opera. You can say, well, I'm interested in culture, and people say, yeah, so am I. There's something going on down the museum, there's Salvador Dali being shown at the museum, or Caravaggios are coming from Malta to Moscow, and on the way back we're going to Poland, let's all go to the National Gallery and look at the Caravaggios. Otherwise we'd have to go to Malta to see them. They think that the culture is about lovely paintings, novels and plays, opera, things like that. That's what some people understand by the term culture. I prefer to say this is what we call high culture, okay, and it's not the meaning of the word culture, which I'm using in a business context. Okay? So we need a different definition for the word culture. And would anybody like to hazard, or does anybody know of a definition that would like to hazard for the word culture in the business context?
Socialization, like
how you interact with other people is good. You were going to say something?
working
Working in the environment is a good. The word working in the environment is good. I'll give you a definition of culture. Hopefully you can all see this. The collective mental programming. Let me just get the exact word in. The collective mental programming of people in the environment, people in an environment, of the people. This is important. I don't want to misquote the guy. Of the people in an environment. Anybody got any idea of who said that?
I don't know about that, but I just want to also add to it. Can it also culture refer to the basic standards, values, or goals that the company is aiming for?
Well, it can, because that's all part of the collective mental program. Yeah? Goals and things like that become part of the culture because you become mentally programmed on a collective basis to think that those goals are important, and therefore they become part of the culture. But they ought not, and they cannot be the whole of the culture, because there's going to be other things that are acceptable in that company other than what's actually written down as goals. They might be a very important feature in the culture, but they won't be all of the culture. The culture in an individual company might even come down to what a particular manager likes and doesn't like. I can tell you, in our company in Warsaw, which is bigger than, which is much bigger than here, we're over several floors, and there's a different culture on each floor. There's a different culture on each floor. There's floors in our organisation where it's okay to listen to music while you work, just because the manager believes that it will relax the person and enable them to work more efficiently. In my floor, I don't allow people to listen to music while I work. Okay? So it's a different culture. I don't believe that it's possible to listen to music and do accountancy properly at the same time. And nobody's managed to persuade me so far that you can, and so therefore I banned it.
They work
Well, you may say that, but if a person's not using part of their brain to process the music, then why are they listening to it? But I want all their brain, because I'm a kind of exploitative person. So, yes.
I thought culture is generally the management system of the profession instead of the activities going on around the departments and the areas.
Well, the culture in the way that this. I mean, what I'm using here is the definition. There's lots of ways in which people could define culture. Okay, and it's possible to anybody could place a different definition for the purposes of an academic paper, or what have you. But this comes from Gert Hofstadter. Has anybody heard of Hofstadter? Have you?
Yes, now.
Okay. So this comes from Hofstadter. You guys are going to be one step ahead of me all the way through the lecture. I must remind you how much roaming for data costs in this part of the the collective mental program of the people in an environment is from Gert Hofstadter. Yeah? I can't say senior and I can't say junior, because there's actually three of them, and he was the one in the middle, so there isn't, I don't know what you call that in America, because I know you like senior and junior. The second. Yeah, so Gert Hofstadter, the second, except that he was a Dutchman, is a Dutchman, he's 83 now, still alive, obviously looks after himself. And the reason why he became I don't think there's ever been like an official ranking of who the major person that has something to say about culture is in the world, but Gert Hofstadter is probably, recognised in academia as being a pretty big voice. So coming back to your question, whether this is necessarily the only possible definition of culture, no, it's not the only possible definition of culture, and you can define it differently for different purposes. Yeah, but for most of what's written and read and the things which revolve around the things that Hofstadter came up with, it all comes down to this being the definition. So a collective mental program, or the collective mental programming of the people in an environment. An environment is actually quite important because it's not just necessarily corporations. Hofstadter started off looking at cultural clashes between countries. Why did he do that? Because, well, the first thing that happened to him is he went to Indonesia, which used to belong to Holland, and he went to Indonesia to sort something out down there, and was a bit surprised that they didn't want to do things necessarily the way that he thought they should be, even though it was supposed to be his colony, etc. They actually had a different culture. It surprised him slightly. Then he got back to Holland again, and he had a big accident. He fell in love. But he fell in love with a woman from a different culture. She was English. Now, some of the biggest, most successful companies in Europe, like Shell, are UK, Dutch entities. You probably know from the history of the United States that the English and the Dutch always got on very well together. So as far as two countries similar to each other are concerned, yeah, you would think that the UK or England and Holland were like brothers. And on an international scale, I suppose we are. There wasn't any fighting between the Dutch and the English over who got what. It wasn't like the French that tried to cut us off, between Louisiana and what have you, they tried to cut us off from getting too far west, from the earlier history of North America, where we had to fight the French in the end. And we didn't fight the Dutch over America, we just got on with it. So, you'd think, wouldn't you? I mean, there have been a few small skirmishes in history between the British and the Dutch, but in the main, we even took part of our royal family from there at one point in the House of Orange. So we've been good friends with the Dutch. So you might be a little bit surprised that the thing that set off Hofstadter in a lifetime of researching international cultures was a romance with a woman from England, which caused him great pain because of culture shock. When he was so close culturally anyway, on a worldwide scale, to England. Well, the English are a little bit funny, but the Dutch are also funny, but they're funny different things, they laugh at different things. Probably the Dutch guy, Hofstadter, probably said a joke to the girl's parents, and they probably said to him, "That's not amusing, please kindly leave our house at once." But I don't know, I'm just making that up. But you do get into a situation where cultural clashes can happen, where you don't expect it. But why Hofstadter is important is, you could talk about culture, national cultures, organisational cultures, and talk about it anecdotally. You can talk about it anecdotally for hours and hours and hours. And if you want to see my film where I do talk about it anecdotally, then just go on YouTube and look up Uncle Davy's Culture Lecture. It's in 4 parts. And you'll see the one that I did last year, different to this one because I believe I could push you guys harder. But if you want to see it, it's there. You just have to find that one on YouTube, Uncle Davy's Culture Lecture. And basically, just rewind my mental tape a little bit. The reason why Hofstadter is important is he didn't just talk anecdotally about it. He brought in dimensions whereby you can actually measure to a degree objectively, because culture is very subjective by its very nature, but he tried to measure objectively along dimensions on a graph, on scales that you could actually measure, aspects of culture, and he came up with 6 of them. This isn't as easy as you think, or you might think. Because what you've got to do is you've got to find criteria whereby you can measure cultures in such a way that they don't overlap, yeah? It's very easy to say, well, here's a dimension where, how much in a culture people trust one another, yeah? And then later on you look at another one and say, well, here's another one where how much criminality there is. And then what you may or may not find or realise at the time is that you've actually got 2 that one is possibly a derivative of the other. If there's high criminality, then it's likely that they don't trust each other so much because of the high criminality, and therefore they're not completely independent characteristics. Whereas Hofstadter came up with 6 dimensions of culture, which are rather not derivative of each other, which are very interesting. And I wanted to, as the main body, what I wanted to bring to you today, is to look at them, because they apply not only to countries, they also can apply to corporations and organisations. They can even apply to families. I mean, remember Hofstadter talked about an environment, the people of an environment. And at the big scale, an environment is the world. Except for it's not helpful to talk about the whole world because we've got nothing to compare it to. You know, if we had other worlds with humanoids on or rather intelligent life, then we could say, well, let's compare Earth culture to these people's culture. Yeah? And of course, on things like Star Trek, that's exactly sort of thinking that you can sometimes see being played with. But on a big scale, you're comparing things like United States culture, which is what Hofstede, most people researching his dimensions have looked at, the United States culture versus, let's say, China. Yeah? So that's looking at big nation culture. You could take Hofstede's dimensions and apply them within the United States, for example, just to different states. You can actually take all of your states and map them all on each of, or put them all on a scale from 1 to 120 on each of the 6 indices which Hofstede came up with. And run the questionnaires on a statistical sample of people, see how they answer the questions, and come up with the scale of where different states in America are, and you'll see differences. And then if you did the same thing within towns, you'd find that within a state, you'd probably find smaller differences of culture. And then you might find if you go uptown within a certain town, you're going to get a difference in culture, which is bigger than even the one that you thought you had when you answered the questionnaire statewide. And within states, you might have more differences in culture within a single state than you thought you had when you got the answers to the questionnaire over the whole of the country. That's the funny thing. And then you go and say, okay, well, within this particular area, what's the culture in this street? There's various organisations that have got their offices in this business park. Do they have a common culture at all? Well, the more you actually focus up on it, the more you'll find that this organisation has a culture radically different to that organisation, based just solely on the 6 main dimensions, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. And also, when we talk about organisations, there are additional dimensions that you can bring in to talk about organisations like companies or government offices, which you wouldn't necessarily be interested in talking about the culture of a whole nation. So let me talk about these dimensions of culture for, I'll take you through them one at a time. The first one is called power distance. The power distance index means, to what extent do people in the given culture, in the given environment, accept that decision-making is done by only an elite or one individual? To which extent do they accept the fact that some people have more say than others? Yeah? And on a scale of 1 to 120, in the first case you can have a look and see what kind of countries are willing to accept that some individuals are able to have much more power than others. Well, you can see immediately implications for politics in there. You think that national cultures would say that we all should have pretty much the same say. They're much more likely to be fighting for democracy and achieving democracy, whereas people that think that, well, it's natural for some people to have a bigger say and others to simply knuckle under and do what they want, those are countries which you might think would be more difficult to understand or to put a value on democracy, and therefore you might expect those countries to be more places where it would be hard to find democracies having developed, where perhaps be more likely to find dictatorships. Just give you a couple of examples. For the power distance index, it was very high for Latin American countries, and very high also in a lot of Asian countries. The lowest of them all was Austria, with only 11, and Denmark was the second lowest with 18. Austria had 18, but wasn't second lowest. Israel second lowest with 13, which is interesting. The United States, well, I won't say the United States yet. I'll give you a couple more. Sweden, 31. Romania, 90. Spain, 57. Britain, United Kingdom, 35. What do you think the United States had on that scale? Sorry? 40. You know a lot. Was that a guess? Or have you read Hofstede? Okay. No, you're right. You're absolutely bang on. That's very good. A lot of cultural sensitivity, I think, you must have. Yes, it's exactly right. The United States has 40 on the scale, so it's not massively democratic or not massively intolerant of some people having a say more than others. Yes?
What's the scale out of then? What does the higher mean that they're less likely to accept that other people have authority?
If you on this particular one, if you're up in the high ones, like 90 was I think about the high, 95 was Guatemala and they came off the worst. Yeah? That means that you are willing to accept in your national culture that you yourself don't have anything to say, you simply obey orders, or that some people don't have anything to say unless they're to obey orders, and some people are there to tell them what to do. So it's the sort of New World Order dream, if you like, of some people being like, in what is it? Not Brave New World. H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where you've got the Morlocks and the Elway. Some people seem to think if you've got a high score, a person that would accept the Morlocks and Elway world of the Time Machine by H.G. Wells, they'd be at the top of the scale, they'd be like 120. Whereas a person that wouldn't be happy and would fight all their life until everybody had an equal say, not only them having an equal say, but making sure that others in the room also had an equal say, they'd be at the theoretical 0, I suppose. So you're on a scale from 0 to 120.
So this, maybe if the number is higher, more the society is dictatorial.
Yes, the people are more. If the number is high, then if your aim in life were to be, let's say, a dictator, like Sacha Baron Cohen, then, I don't know if anybody's seen that yet. It's the latest film by Borat. Yes. If your aim in life, or if your goal in life was to be a dictator, then and you were shopping, you were like country shopping for where shall I go and live and become this dictator, you would be looking for high values on that index. Yeah. So that's the first of the 6 of power distance. Okay. The second, and this is not derivative, although some people might think it was slightly derivative, is individualism. The reason why it's not derivative from power distance is it